Excuse me, this area is restricted. The voice cut through the tension of the surgical corridor like a scalpel. Dr. Adrian Cole paused just outside operating room 3. Bright hospital lights reflected off the polished floor. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. A stretcher rushed past with a patient being prepped for surgery. Adrian turned slowly. A nurse stood a few feet away, arms crossed over her scrubs. Staff only beyond this point, she added. Adrian blinked once. I am staff, he replied calmly. The nurse frowned. Her eyes moved over him quickly, his dark skin, his travel-wrinkled scrubs, the small duffel bag hanging from his shoulder. I haven't seen you here before, she said. That's because I just arrived. Another nurse nearby slowed down, listening. Adrian glanced toward the operating room doors. Is this OR 3? Yes, she said. Good, he replied, stepping forward. She blocked his path. Hold on, her tone sharpened. Which department are you with? Adrian exhaled slowly. Cardiothorax surgery. The nurse let out a small laugh. Really? 2 more staff members turned toward them now? Adrian kept his voice steady. Yes. She shook her head. The surgical team is already inside. I think you're in the wrong area. Adrian opened his duffel bag and reached inside. Look, she interrupted, raising a hand. If you're delivering equipment or something, you can leave it at the desk. A few whispers started behind them. Adrian paused. Then he gently closed the bag again. I'm not delivering anything, he said. I'm here to operate. 3 floors above, inside the hospital boardroom, tension filled the air. The patient scheduled for surgery wasn't ordinary. Jonathan Holy, billionaire philanthropist and major donor to the hospital, had collapsed from a severe aortic dissection only hours earlier. His condition was critical. Most surgeons wouldn't attempt the complex procedure required to save him. But the hospital had made one emergency call to a man whose name carried legendary weight in cardiac medicine, Dr. Adrian Cole. Within 40 minutes of the call, Adrian had boarded a private jet from Atlanta. Now he was standing outside the operating room where his patient waited, and being told he didn't belong there. Back in the surgical corridor, the first nurse had grown more confident. Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the operating area. Adrian remained still. Your name? She asked. Dr. Adrian Cole. The second nurse frowned. That name sounds familiar. The first nurse shrugged. It doesn't matter. He's not on our surgical roster. Adrian glanced at the digital board listing scheduled surgeons. His name wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. Emergency flights don't update hospital databases instantly. I was called in for a consult, he said calmly. For what surgery? She asked. The Halle procedure. Both nurses stared at him. You mean Jonathan Halle? One asked. Yes. The bus nurse shook her head firmly. That surgery is being handled by Dr. Whitaker. Adrian nodded slightly. Yes, and I'm here to assist him. The nurse crossed her arms again. Well, Dr. Whitaker hasn't mentioned anyone coming. Another whisper behind them. Someone quietly pulled out a phone. Adrian checked the time on the wall clock. Every minute mattered. Could you please call him? Adrian asked. The nurse sighed dramatically. Security, she muttered under her breath. Adrian heard it. He said nothing. Inside operating room 3, Dr. Leonard Whitaker was already scrubbed in, studying the patient's scans. The door swung open. A junior resident stepped inside quickly. Doctor, he said, there's a situation outside. Whitaker looked up. What kind of situation? There's a man claiming to be a surgeon trying to enter the OR. Whitaker frowned. What's his name? Adrian Cole. Whitaker frowned. For a moment, the room went completely still. You said Adrian Cole? Yes. Whitaker immediately pulled off his gloves. Why is he not in here? The resident swallowed. Security might be involved. Whitaker stormed toward the door. Back in the corridor, Adrian stood quietly while the nurses debated. He's clearly not part of the surgical staff, one said. The other nodded. We should verify before letting him wander into an OR. Adrian leaned against the wall calmly. Then the operating room doors burst open. Dr. Whitaker stepped out. His eyes locked onto Adrian instantly. Oh my God. The nurses turned. Whitaker walked directly toward Adrian. Dr. Cole, he said, breathless, I'm so sorry. The hallway went silent. Whitaker turned toward the nurses. Why is the lead surgeon standing outside? The first nurse blinked. Lead surgeon Whitaker gestured toward Adrian. This is the man flying across the country to save Mr. Hell's life. The second nurse's face strained of color. Adrian gave a small nod. Good to see you again, Leonard. Whitaker shook his head. I should have met you at the entrance. The first nurse stepped backward. I didn't realize. Whitaker interrupted gently but firmly. Dr. Cole developed the surgical method we're about to use. Someone's phone dropped to the floor. Adrian picked up his duffel bag. Shall we begin? He asked calmly. Whitaker nodded immediately. Yes, we're already behind schedule. The nurses stepped aside. Adrian walked through the operating room doors without another word. The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. Inside the operating room, every movement was precise. Adrian's hands moved with calm confidence, guiding the team through one of the most difficult heart procedures known in modern medicine. Even Whitaker found himself learning in real time. At one point he whispered, "Incredible." Adrian simply focused on the patient. Outside, the hospital buzzed with quiet tension. News had spread quickly. The legendary Dr. Adrian Cole was inside the building. Hours later, the operating room doors finally opened. Whitaker stepped out first. A waiting group of administrators and staff immediately surrounded him. Was someone asked? Whitaker smiled. Successful. Relief spread through the hallway. A moment later, Adrian stepped out. The same nurses who had stopped him earlier stood nearby. They looked like they wished the floor would swallow them. The first nurse stepped forward. "Dr. Cole, I owe you an apology." Adrian studied her expression. Not defensive. Just embarrassed. "We were trying to protect the operating room," she said quietly. Adrian nodded once. "And now the patient is protected too." Whitaker glanced at Adrian. "You handled that with incredible patience." Adrian smiled faintly. "When you spend your life proving you belong in rooms like that, patience becomes a skill." Later that afternoon, inside the hospital boardroom, the chairman arrived. The man shook Adrian's hand firmly. "Dr. Cole, you saved one of our most important donors today." Adrian shook his head slightly. "I saved a patient." The chairman smiled. "Still, the hospital owes you a great deal." Adrian looked out the window toward the city skyline of Chicago. "Actually," he said thoughtfully, "there's something I'd like to discuss." The chairman raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "A training program." "For what?" Adrian turned back toward the room. "For recognizing talent before questioning belonging." The room fell quiet, because the lesson had landed. Weeks later, the hospital launched a new mentorship program under Adrian's guidance. Young doctors from diverse backgrounds were invited to train under the country's top surgeons, not because of politics, because of potential. And inside Operating Room 3, a new plaque was installed quietly on the wall. "Excellence belongs wherever it stands." Adrian visited the hospital once more before returning home. This time, when he walked through the surgical corridor, every nurse greeted him with respect, not because he demanded it, because he had earned it long before they realized who he was. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, Adrian glanced up at the hospital building. The same doors that once questioned him now welcomed him. Not loudly, but clearly. And sometimes that's the most powerful kind of justice. The story of that surgery didn't stay inside the hospital for long. Within days, word had spread through medical circles across Chicago. Doctors who had trained with Dr. Adrian Cole began sharing the news quietly. The impossible aortic repair had been successful. Jonathan Hawley was alive and recovering. But the story people kept repeating wasn't just about the surgery. It was about the hallway, about the moment one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in the country had been stopped outside an operating room and asked to prove he belonged there. Adrian himself never spoke publicly about it. He simply returned to his hospital in Atlanta and went back to work. But inside the Chicago hospital, the moment stayed with people, especially the nurses who had been in that corridor. 2 weeks later, the hospital hosted the first session of the new mentorship program Adrian had proposed. The auditorium filled with young medical residents, interns, and surgical fellows. Some had traveled from across the country just to attend. On stage stood Dr. Adrian Cole. No dramatic introduction, no long list of achievements, just a quiet presence and a room full of future doctors watching him closely. Adriana adjusted the microphone slightly. "When I was in medical school," he began, "I learned something interesting about heart surgery." The room went silent. People assume the hardest part is the technical skill. He shook his head gently. "It's not." He paused. "The hardest part is trust." A few residents leaned forward in their seats. "Trust between surgeons," Adrian continued. "Trust between doctors and patients. And sometimes, trust between colleagues who have never met before." He didn't mention the hallway incident directly, but everyone in the hospital knew what he meant. Adrian continued speaking calmly. "Medicine is built on expertise, but expertise doesn't always arrive looking the way people expect." A few heads nodded slowly. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with several young residents who looked both nervous and inspired. "When I entered my first operating room as a resident," Adrian said, "someone asked me if I was part of the cleaning crew." A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Adrian smiled slightly. "I didn't get angry. I just focused on becoming so good at what I did that eventually the question stopped being asked." A hand raised from the audience. It was a young surgical resident. "Dr. Cole, how do you stay calm when people doubt you?" Adrian thought for a moment. "Because doubt doesn't change the work," he replied. The answer hung in the air. Your responsibility is still the same. The patient still needs the surgery. The heart still needs repair. Another resident spoke up. Did those experiences ever make you want to quit? Adrian shook his head immediately. No, then he added quietly. They made me want to open more doors. Meanwhile, on the cardiac recovery floor, Jonathan Hole was sitting upright for the first time since his surgery. His recovery had been remarkable. Dr. Whitaker stood nearby reviewing his chart. Hole looked up. I'd like to meet the surgeon who saved my life, he said. Whitaker smiled. You already did. Hole frowned slightly. What do you mean? Whitaker explained the entire story, from Adrian's emergency flight to the hallway misunderstanding to the 6-hour procedure that saved him. Hole listened carefully. When Whitaker finished, the billionaire patient leaned back against the pillows. That man walked through all of that and still focused on my surgery, Hole asked. Yes. Hole shook his head slowly. Extraordinary. He looked toward the window where the skyline of Chicago stretched into the distance. Get me his contact information, Hole said. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. For what? Hole smiled. I'm funding his mentorship program. The donation came quietly but powerfully. Within months, the mentorship initiative expanded nationwide. Young surgeons from underserved communities received training opportunities they had never imagined. Operating rooms that once felt unreachable suddenly felt possible. Adrian never sought recognition for it. He simply continued showing up, teaching, operating, mentoring. One afternoon, months later, Adrian returned to the same hospital in Chicago for a follow-up conference. This time, when he walked through the surgical corridor, something felt different. No hesitation, no questioning glances, just respect. One of the nurses from that original day approached him. Dr. Cole, she said warmly. The mentorship program just accepted its 50th student. Adrian smiled. That's good news. She hesitated before adding something else. I'm one of the volunteers helping train them. Adrian nodded approvingly. Then the program is already working. As he continued down the corridor, he passed the operating room doors where everything had started. The plaque beside the door reflected softly under the hospital lights. Excellence belongs wherever it stands. Adrian paused for a moment, not because he needed validation, but because the message mattered. Then he continued walking, because somewhere, another patient was waiting. And for Adrian Cole, the work had always been the point. Not proving he belonged, but saving lives once he stepped inside the room.